A woman once sat on the throne of St. Peter. For centuries, the legend of Pope Joan, a female pontiff who supposedly reigned in the 9th century, has persisted as one of history's most tantalizing and controversial mysteries. By the end of this journey, you will have the tools to separate medieval myth from historical fact. We will sift through ancient manuscripts, uncover the political warfare fought with this story, and examine why a tale of a pregnant pope giving birth during a procession was so widely believed. What does our fascination with this impossible story truly reveal about power, fear, and the stories we choose to believe? The legend itself is a story of astonishing ambition and devastating exposure. It tells of a young woman, often said to be from the city of Mainz, possessing a brilliant mind in an era that offered women no formal path for scholarship. Driven by a thirst for knowledge, she made a radical decision. She cut her hair, adopted male attire, and under the name John Anglicus entered the monastic world. Her intellect was so formidable that she rose with remarkable speed through the rigid hierarchy of the church. From monk to priest, from priest to cardinal, her disguise remained flawless, her counsel so valued that upon the death of Pope Leo IV, the cardinals elected her as his successor. She became Pope John VIII, ruling from the throne of St. Peter for 2 years, 5 months and 4 days, a period remembered in the tales as one of wise and just governance. But this double life carried a terrible risk. The Pope had taken a lover, a chamberlain, or perhaps a cleric, and became pregnant. For a time, her robes concealed the truth. The crisis arrived during a solemn religious procession. The new pope was traveling from St. Peter's Basilica to the Lateran Palace, a traditional route through the heart of Rome. As the procession moved through a narrow lane between the Colosseum and the Church of St. Clement, the labor pains began. There, in the dusty street, surrounded by a horrified crowd of clergy and citizens, Pope Joan gave birth, her secret and her authority dissolving in a single, chaotic moment. The stories diverge on her fate. Some say she died in childbirth right there on the cobblestones. Others claim an enraged mob stoned her and the infant to death. But the location was forever marked. That lane became known as the Vicus Papissa, the street of the Popes, a place where guides would point and whisper about the scandal that once shook the very foundations of Christendom. But such a vivid and shocking story demands evidence. To understand if Pope Joan could be real, we must follow the paper trail back to its source, and that trail begins not in the 9th century when she supposedly reigned, but in the 13th. The first clear, detailed written accounts of a female pope emerged nearly 400 years after her alleged death. This gap is not a minor detail. It is a chasm. Think of the scale of the scandal. A woman disguised as a man becomes the supreme head of Western Christianity, only to be exposed giving birth during a papal procession. In the tightly controlled, meticulously documented world of the medieval church, such an event would have been cataclysmic. It would have been the subject of urgent letters, furious condemnations, and panicked chronicles across Europe. Yet from the 9th century itself, there is nothing. No angry papal decree, no shocked diary entry from a visiting monk, not a single whisper in any surviving document written during the decade she was supposed to have lived. The silence is deafening. The story surfaces with authority in the works of 13th century chroniclers, men who are compiling official histories. One of the most influential was a Dominican friar named Martin of Opava, also known as Martin Polonus. In his Chronicle of the Popes and Emperors, written around the year 1270, he included a sober entry for Pope John VIII. He wrote that this John was actually a woman who had come from England disguised as a man, excelled in learning, was elected pope, and then gave birth during a procession, after which she died. Martin presented this not as a wild rumor, but as a factual entry in a historical list. His work was copied and spread widely, becoming a standard reference in monasteries and libraries. Other chroniclers soon followed, adding their own details and variations, cementing the tale in the popular imagination. The significance of Martin writing in the 1270s cannot be overstated. He was writing about events said to have happened in the 850s. That is like someone today writing a detailed, factual biography of a US president from the 1600s with no contemporary sources to back it up. For historians, this enormous time gap is the first and most glaring red flag. It suggests the story of Pope Joan is not a hidden truth finally revealed, but a legend that grew and hardened over centuries, finding its way into history books long after the fact. But if the written records appeared centuries late, what about the physical evidence? The legend of Pope Joan gave rise to one of the most bizarre and enduring pieces of alleged papal ritual, centered on a very peculiar piece of furniture. This was the sedia stercoraria, a name that translates quite bluntly to the dung chair. According to popular tales that spread in the later Middle Ages, this was not a throne of glory, but one of humiliation and verification. It was said to be a marble seat pierced with a large hole in the center. The story goes that during the installation of a new pope, part of the ceremony involved him sitting upon this chair. A junior deacon would then kneel beneath it, reach up through the opening, and perform a physical examination to confirm the pope's masculinity. Upon finding the required proof, the deacon would announce to the assembled crowd, "Duos habet et bene pendens." He has two, and they dangle well. Only after this grotesque confirmation would the pope be declared valid and the ceremony proceed. On the surface, this seems like a direct, if shocking, response to the Joan scandal. A permanent safeguard baked into the most sacred of rituals to ensure such a deception could never happen again. It feels like the ultimate proof that the Church itself believed the story was true and took drastic measures. But did this ritual ever actually happen? The historical record, once again, is murky and telling. No official papal ceremony book, no detailed eyewitness account from a medieval coronation ever describes this specific act. The first clear mentions of the sedia stercoraria as an examination tool appear in writings from the 15th and 16th centuries, long after the Joan legend was fully established. This timing is crucial. It suggests the chair story is not the cause of the Joan myth, but a consequence of it. It is a piece of folklore that grew up around the legend, a satirical and exaggerated invention meant to explain how such a thing could have happened and to mock the elaborate, often opaque rituals of the papal court. The name itself, dung chair, offers another clue. Stercoraria is related to dung or excrement. Some historians argue the chair's original purpose was far more mundane and symbolic, having nothing to do with gender verification. There are references in older texts to a ceremony where the Pope would sit on a simple marble seat, perhaps once used as a commode, and receive a handful of coins as a symbol of humility, a reminder that even the Pontiff was human. The vulgar nickname and the outrageous story of the examination could have easily attached themselves to this obscure object over time, transforming a symbol of humility into a tool for scandal. So, while a pierced marble seat may have existed, its purpose was almost certainly not the one described in the salacious tales. The sedia stercoraria stands not as proof of Pope Joan's reality, but as a monument to the power of the story itself. It shows how a compelling legend can rewrite history, inventing its own artifacts and rituals to feel more true, to answer the questions it raises with tangible, if imaginary, evidence. The silence of the 9th century is not just an absence of evidence, it is a window into a world where such a story could take root and flourish. To understand why, we must step away from papal palaces and into the daily reality of medieval Europe, particularly the starkly limited world of women. In the 9th century, the idea of a woman becoming a scholar, let alone a theologian of such renown, was not just unlikely, it was institutionally impossible. Universities, as we know them, did not yet exist. Formal learning was centered in monastic schools, and these were almost exclusively male domains. A brilliant young woman with a thirst for sacred texts and philosophical debate had no sanctioned path to follow. Her intellect was a door for which society held no key. This rigid exclusion forms the essential backdrop of the Joan legend. Her disguise, therefore, is not presented as a frivolous trick, but as a desperate and logical necessity for a mind that refused to be confined. It was the only conceivable way for such a character, in the imagination of a later age, to access the world of knowledge and power she was destined for. This motif of the disguised woman was not a shocking novelty to medieval audiences. In fact, it was a cherished and recurring archetype in their own religious stories. Saints' lives or hagiographies were the popular literature of the day, filled with tales of extraordinary faith. Among them were stories of women who cut their hair, donned men's robes, and entered monasteries to live devoted lives to God, their true identities hidden for decades. One of the most famous was Saint Marina, who lived as the monk Marinus. Her story follows a familiar arc. She enters a monastery with her father, maintains her disguise through years of pious service, is falsely accused of fathering a child, accepts the humiliation as a penance, and is only revealed as a woman upon her death, to the astonishment and reverence of her brothers. These tales were not told as scandals but as testaments to supreme piety and humility. The disguise was a means to a holy end. This context transforms how we see the Pope Joan narrative. Her story did not emerge in a vacuum that found the concept of a woman in disguise unbelievable. On the contrary, it emerged in a culture deeply familiar with and admiring of that very plotline. The legend of Joan takes this familiar archetype, the holy woman disguised as a monk, and pushes it to its most audacious and terrifying extreme. What if such a woman did not just become a humble brother, but through her virtue and intellect rose to become the father of all brothers? What if the disguise succeeded beyond any wildest dream? This is where the story pivots from pious admiration to profound cultural anxiety. It blends that existing template of female devotion with a deep-seated fear of women usurping ultimate male authority. The legend becomes a gripping, cautionary tale that uses a familiar framework to explore a terrifying taboo. It allowed medieval people to marvel at the possibility of such brilliance and devotion, while ultimately reinforcing the natural order through its catastrophic, bloody conclusion. The pregnancy, then, is the crucial narrative device that ensures the fantasy cannot stand. It is the unavoidable biological truth that shatters the illusion, restoring the world to its proper alignment. So the story was believable not because it happened, but because it fit a pattern they already knew, while playing upon fears they already felt. It was the ultimate what-if, built from the very stones of their own culture. The legend of Pope Joan did not simply entertain, it armed critics with a devastating weapon. By the 13th century, when the story first solidified in chronicles, the papacy was embroiled in a brutal power struggle known as the investiture controversy, a decades-long fight with secular rulers over who had the right to appoint bishops. This conflict laid bare the immense political and financial corruption at the heart of the Church. Reformist movements began to rise, voices crying out that the papacy had lost its way, that it was more a worldly empire than a spiritual guide. In this atmosphere of intense criticism, the tale of a female pope was not just a scandal, it was perfect propaganda. It provided a single, unforgettable image that encapsulated every fear and accusation, the ultimate symbol of a corrupted, deceitful institution. Think of it like a political cartoon, but for an age of manuscripts. The story said, "Look, the church you trust to be the bedrock of truth is so morally bankrupt, so blind, that it could not even tell a woman was leading it, a woman who then compounded the sin with a sexual scandal right in the streets of Rome." For reformers, this was not history, it was a parable. It proved the entire hierarchy was capable of the most profound abomination. This utility only grew more potent centuries later. When the Protestant Reformation erupted in the 16th century, shattering the unity of Western Christianity, the legend of Pope Joan was ready ammunition. Protestant theologians and pamphleteers seized upon the story with gusto. To figures like Martin Luther and his followers, Joan was the ultimate evidence of the Roman Catholic Church's decadence and divine disfavor. How could an institution led by a woman, and a pregnant woman at that, possibly be the true heir of St. Peter? They reprinted the old chronicles, illustrated lurid pamphlets, and cited Joan repeatedly as proof that the papacy was the very whore of Babylon foretold in the book of Revelation. The story was a perfect fit for their narrative, a seemingly historical fact that demonstrated the Church had been fundamentally illegitimate for centuries. Even within the Catholic world, dissenting groups used the tale. The Fraticelli, a radical faction of Franciscan friars in the 14th century who preached absolute poverty and condemned the wealth of the papal court, also wielded the Joan story. For them, she was the embodiment of a papacy that had fallen into luxury and sin, a sign that the true Church was elsewhere. In every case, the details of the legend mattered less than its emotional and symbolic power. It was a weapon of ideological warfare designed to undermine authority by attacking it at its most sacred point, its claim to an unbroken, divinely guided line of male succession. The story was flexible. It could be used to argue for church reform, for its complete overthrow, or for the superiority of one sect over another. Its longevity is a testament not to its historical truth, but to its political usefulness. For hundreds of years, if you wanted to attack the papacy, you told the story of Pope Joan. It was the nuclear option of medieval and early modern insults, a single narrative that carried the weight of deception, sexual immorality, and the overturning of the natural order. It framed the entire institution as not just flawed, but as fundamentally fraudulent. Faced with this potent weapon of myth, the Vatican's response evolved from silence to systematic erasure. The Catholic Church has never officially recognized Pope Joan as a historical figure, consistently dismissing her as a fable or a malicious fabrication. But as the legend's political power grew, particularly during the Protestant Reformation, simple denial was no longer enough. The story had become embedded in art, literature, and even some older chronicles, giving it a dangerous veneer of authenticity. The Church needed to purge it from the record, and one of the most visible attempts came from one of the most formidable popes of the Counter-Reformation, Sixtus V. In the late 1580s, he took direct action regarding a physical representation of the legend. In the Siena Cathedral, there was a famous series of busts depicting the line of popes. Among them, for generations, stood a figure labeled Johannes Roman VIII, Femina ex Anglia, John VIII, a woman from England. This was not a hidden secret, it was public art, a tourist curiosity that gave the story tangible form. Pope Sixtus, in a decisive move, ordered the bust removed and destroyed. He could not allow a monument, especially in a major cathedral, to perpetuate what the Church deemed a heretical lie. This was not an attempt to hide a truth, but to eliminate a symbol. It was an act of ideological hygiene, scrubbing away a damaging image that challenged the very foundation of papal legitimacy. This effort at erasure extended to the most important historical record the Church possessed, the Liber Pontificalis, or the Book of Popes. This was the official, continuously updated chronicle of papal reigns, a sacred lineage tracing an unbroken chain back to St. Peter. And within its pages there is no Pope Joan. There is no gap, no mysterious 2-year period where the record goes fuzzy. The chronicle lists Pope Leo IV, who died in 855, and he is directly succeeded by Pope Benedict III, who began his reign in that same year. For the legend to be true, the entire meticulously kept official history of the mid-9th century would have to be a complete forgery, inserted after the fact to expunge her. While historical records can be altered, the consistency and breadth of the Liber Pontificalis, along with corroborating documents from outside Rome like letters and imperial annals, make a conspiracy of that scale highly improbable. The absence is more logically explained by the fact that she was never there to record in the first place. So, was this a cover-up? To frame it that way is to accept the legend's premise as fact and then interpret all actions as a reaction to that fact. A more historically grounded view is to see the Vatican's actions as a defensive campaign against a powerful piece of anti-papal propaganda. Think of it not as hiding a body but as fighting a ghost. The story of Pope Joan directly attacked the doctrine of apostolic succession, the belief that the authority of Jesus was passed directly to Peter and then in an unbroken line to his successors. If that line included a woman who deceived the entire church and then died in a scandal of childbirth, the entire theological foundation of papal infallibility and authority crumbled. For the Counter-Reformation Church, battling for its very survival against Protestant critics who wielded the Joan story like a hammer, allowing the myth to stand in art or be tacitly acknowledged in semi-official histories was untenable. Removing a bust or omitting a name from a list was not evidence of a hidden truth, it was a statement of doctrinal and historical conviction. It was the institution declaring, "This story is a lie, and we will not grant it the dignity of a place in our house." The irony, of course, is that these acts of suppression often fueled the very rumors they sought to quell. Why destroy the bust if she never existed? Why be so forceful in the denial? For skeptics, this energy itself became proof of a guilty conscience. This is the trap of fighting a myth. Your efforts to kill it can sometimes make it stronger, giving it the allure of forbidden knowledge. The Vatican chose to fight the myth on the battlefield of symbols and records, a clear reflection of just how dangerous and enduring they believed the story to be. Yet for all the official denials and logical inconsistencies, the legend refuses to die. Its stubborn persistence is for many the first piece of evidence in its favor. A story does not survive for over 1,000 years, told from Ireland to Constantinople, without some spark of truth at its heart. This is the core argument from those who believe in a historical Joan, that such an elaborate and specific scandal could not have been invented from whole cloth. They point to the web of anecdotes, place names, and curious inconsistencies that, when woven together, form a compelling case for a hidden history. One of the most tantalizing threads is an alleged contemporary source. Proponents often cite the Byzantine historian Anastasius Bibliothecarius, who lived in the 9th century and served as the Vatican librarian. In a later copy of his work, a marginal note was found that seemed to reference a female pope. The note is cryptic and its authenticity hotly debated, but for believers it is a whisper from the very era in question, a potential crack in the wall of silence. If genuine, it would be a seismic discovery, a near contemporary acknowledging the impossible. Then there is the curious matter of the papal list. In some medieval chronicles and later reconstructions, a strange anomaly appears in the numbering. Pope Leo IV is followed directly by Pope Benedict III, just as the official record states, but in these alternative lists, Benedict is sometimes numbered as the fourth, not the third, in his name. Why would there be a skipped number? For believers, this is not a clerical error, but a ghost in the machine. It is the echo of a pope who was later removed, a John who was expunged so thoroughly that only the numerical hiccup remains, a phantom limb of history. This idea feeds directly into the most powerful argument for a cover-up, the argument from motive. If the scandal did happen, the Church would have had every reason to bury it with unprecedented thoroughness. The exposure of a female pope, pregnant and giving birth during a procession, would have been the most catastrophic event in the history of Christendom. It would have destroyed the Church's spiritual authority, its political power, and its very claim to be the bride of Christ. In such a scenario, the response would not have been to document the disaster, but to enact a complete and total damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory. Every official record would be altered, every letter recalling the event destroyed, every chronicler in Rome pressured into silence. The lack of contemporary evidence, therefore, is not proof it didn't happen. It is proof of how successfully and desperately it was hidden. The silence itself becomes the scream. This perspective finds support in the legend's deep cultural footprint, far beyond dusty manuscripts. Look at the tarot deck. Among the 22 major arcana cards, one has long been known as the papess or the high priestess. She is depicted as a woman in papal robes, holding a book of wisdom, sitting between two pillars. While later occult traditions assigned her deeper meanings, her origin in the popular card games of the Renaissance is clear. She was Pope Joan, a figure so embedded in the European imagination that she earned a permanent place in the iconography of fortune-telling. She became a symbol of hidden knowledge and forbidden power, a cultural memory stamped onto cardstock. For believers, these fragments form a mosaic. The persistent story, the curious marginal note, the skipped papal number, the extreme motive for a cover-up, and her enduring presence in art and culture, all point not to a mere fable, but to a historical trauma so severe it was scrubbed from the official record, only to live on in the stubborn whispers of legend. They argue we are not looking for a well-documented pope, but for a ghost, and the signs of her passage are the very efforts made to erase her. For historians, the weight of evidence tips the scales decisively. The scholarly consensus is nearly unanimous. Pope Joan is a powerful medieval legend, not a lost chapter of history. This conclusion isn't a dismissal, but the result of applying rigorous standards to every claim. Let's examine the evidence for Joan piece by piece and see why it crumbles under scrutiny. First, the supposed contemporary source, the note attributed to the 9th century librarian Anastasius. Upon close examination, this note appears in only a single, much later manuscript. The handwriting, the ink, and the phrasing all suggest it was added centuries after Anastasius lived, likely by a scribe who knew the legend and inserted it as a marginal comment. It's a classic case of a later insertion being mistaken for an original source, a forgery by time, not by intent. Then there's the argument about the skipped papal number, the idea that Benedict III should have been the fourth. This isn't a ghost, it's a historical hiccup with a clear explanation. During the chaotic period after Leo IV's death, there was a brief, violent struggle. A faction in Rome installed an anti-pope, a man named Anastasius. He held power for just a few weeks before being deposed in favor of the legitimate Benedict. In some lists, this Anastasius, the anti-pope, was counted, creating confusion in the numbering. Other lists, seeking to deny the illegitimate ruler any place, omitted him. The skipped number isn't evidence of a deleted female pope. It's evidence of a messy political fight with a man at its center. Perhaps the most telling silence comes from the papacy's fiercest enemies. The 9th century was not a time of universal reverence for Rome. The Carolingian emperors, the Byzantine Church, and local Roman nobles were all in constant, often vicious conflict with the Pope. They wrote letters, chronicles, and polemics attacking papal authority, listing every real and imagined vice of the pontiffs. If a woman had been exposed giving birth during a procession, it would have been the ultimate propaganda gift. Yet not a single enemy in any document from that century ever mentions it. They called popes murderers, adulterers, and heretics, but never once did they accuse one of being a woman. This silence from those who had every motive to shout it from the rooftops is deafening. Finally, we must consider the sheer practical impossibility. The medieval papal court was not a private place. It was a crowded, bustling political hive. The Pope was surrounded day and night by attendants, guards, secretaries, and clergy. The idea that a pregnancy could be concealed through the later, obvious stages, that labor could begin unexpectedly during a procession, and that a newborn infant could then vanish from the historical record amidst that public chaos, stretches credulity beyond its breaking point. The logistics of the story belong to fable, not to the gritty reality of daily life in the 9th century. So where does this leave us? With a compelling story born not from events, but from the fertile ground of cultural anxiety, political warfare, and the human love for a sensational tale. The legend of Pope Joan endures not because it is true, but because it is a perfect mirror, reflecting our deepest fears about authority, deception, and the boundaries of identity. But if the legend is not a memory of a real woman, could it be a distorted reflection of a real man? To find the possible seed of this story, we must look not to a phantom pope, but to a very real and controversial one, Pope John VIII, who reigned from 872 to 882. His papacy was not a quiet one. He ruled during a period of extreme crisis, with Muslim Saracen forces raiding the Italian coast and the Carolingian Empire fracturing after the death of Charlemagne's descendants. John was a shrewd and active diplomat, constantly negotiating for military aid and political stability. And it is in these negotiations that we find a fascinating connection. One of the most powerful figures John had to contend with was Empress Engelberga, the wife of Emperor Louis II, and after his death, a formidable political operator in her own right. Engelberga was a force. She controlled vast lands, commanded armies, and wielded significant influence over who would sit on the imperial throne. Pope John, needing her support and that of her faction, engaged with her extensively. To his enemies within the Roman aristocracy and the Church, this necessary diplomacy looked like something else entirely. It looked like weakness. It looked like the Pope was being dominated by a woman. In the hyper-masculine, warrior-centric culture of the 9th century, a leader perceived as yielding to a woman was undermining his own authority. The criticism took a particular shape. Chroniclers and political opponents began to describe Pope John VIII in terms that questioned his very manhood. They called him feeble, they implied he was cowardly, and they used language that painted him as effeminate, as being under the thumb of Empress Engelberga. This was a potent insult, attacking the core of his fitness to rule as both a secular protector and a spiritual father. Now follow this thread through the centuries. What begins as political slander, a metaphor saying the Pope is acting like a woman, is passed down through oral tradition and fragmented histories. Over hundreds of years in the game of historical telephone, the metaphor could have hardened into a literal fact. The story of the Pope who was dominated by a woman could have slowly transformed through retelling and exaggeration into the story of the Pope who was a woman. The name provided the anchor. Pope John VIII was a well-documented figure. His dealings with Engelberga were a matter of record. The malicious gossip about his character survived in hostile chronicles. For a later age, looking back and trying to make sense of these old, suggestive whispers, the leap to a literal female pope named John would not be a giant one. It would be a way to explain the strange, emasculating criticism attached to his name. This theory provides an elegant and historically grounded origin for the legend. It doesn't require a massive conspiracy or a hidden pregnancy. It requires only the normal human tendency to literalize metaphor and to spin scandalous tales from the raw material of political mudslinging. The formidable shadow of Empress Engelberga, a woman who truly did wield power over popes and emperors, may have slowly merged with the caricature of her supposed puppet, Pope John, eventually giving birth in the popular imagination to the ultimate usurper, Pope Joan. The legend, then, might be a double distortion, a story that first turned a man into a metaphor, and then turned that metaphor back into a woman, creating a haunting and unforgettable ghost from the echoes of a real political feud. The legend of Pope Joan is not just a story about a disguise, it is a story about a profound and terrifying pollution. At its heart, this tale pulsates with a deep medieval anxiety, the fear that female intelligence and ambition, once allowed to cross into sacred male spaces, would inevitably corrupt and destroy them. Joan's brilliance is not celebrated, it is the engine of her transgression. her very mind becomes a weapon used to infiltrate the most holy sanctuary on earth, the papal throne itself. This narrative frames her not as a victim of circumstance, but as an active deceiver whose success is the ultimate perversion. Her story serves as a powerful, chilling cautionary tale for any woman who might dare to overstep the rigid boundaries set for her. It whispers a warning that female ambition, when directed toward domains of knowledge and power reserved for men, is inherently dangerous and will lead to ruin. This fear was woven into the fabric of medieval life. Holy spaces, from monasteries to the priesthood, were seen as masculine preserves, walls built to keep the world, and particularly the influence of women, at a distance. The very concept of a woman leading mass or interpreting scripture was not just illegal, it was unthinkable, a spiritual contamination. Joan's legend embodies this nightmare, proving what the establishment always feared, that if a woman got in, she would defile it from the inside. Her final exposure through pregnancy is the narrative's brutal, logical conclusion. In this worldview, female sexuality is not private. It is a disruptive, uncontrollable force that betrays and humiliates. It is the flaw that cannot be hidden forever, the biological truth that shatters the intellectual illusion. The public birth in the street is not a tragic accident. It is a divine punishment, a spectacle designed to reveal the carnality beneath the holy robes and to restore the natural order through shocking, visceral humiliation. To understand the full weight of this condemnation, we must see Joan in contrast to the only other powerful female archetype the medieval church celebrated, the Virgin Mary. Mary represents the ideal, the perfect woman, eternally pure, obedient, and humble. Her fertility is miraculous, chaste, and sanctioned by God. She is the vessel for divine grace, not her own ambition. Pope Joan is constructed as her dark mirror, her evil twin. Where Mary is pure, Joan is deceptive. Where Mary's body serves God's will without sin, Joan's body serves her own desires and leads to scandal. Where Mary's motherhood redeems humanity, Joan's motherhood destroys her authority and unleashes chaos. Joan becomes the whore of Babylon to Mary's bride of Christ, a symbol of how female power, when untethered from male control and divine mandate, becomes a source of corruption and apocalyptic disaster. This duality reinforced a brutal, binary message for medieval society. A woman could be either a saint on a pedestal or a dangerous impostor in the streets, but she could never be a scholar, a leader, or a pope. The legend of Joan policed that boundary with a terrifying story. It allowed audiences to briefly marvel at the fantasy of such a brilliant woman, while ultimately reassuring them that the universe itself would conspire to punish such arrogance, to rip away the disguise and reveal the threatening truth beneath. Her story endured not because it celebrated a hidden heroine, but because it so effectively channeled ancient fears into an unforgettable and supposedly historical example. Yet this powerful story did not live only in words, it demanded to be seen. Across centuries, artists gave the legend of Pope Joan a face, transforming whispered scandal into vivid, unforgettable imagery that cemented her in the popular mind. One of the most significant and now lost depictions was a fresco in the Siena Cathedral. For generations, visitors could gaze upon a portrait labeled Pope John VIII, a woman from England, her image set among the solemn line of pontiffs. She was depicted in full papal regalia, a commanding figure of spiritual authority. This was not hidden art, it was public and monumental, a visual declaration that the story was accepted as historical fact within the very walls of a great church. The fresco's existence and its eventual destruction on the orders of Pope Sixtus V tells its own story. It shows how deeply the legend had infiltrated culture and how fiercely the church later fought to scrub that visual proof from the record. In illuminated manuscripts, the tale took on more intimate narrative forms. The Hortus Deliciarum, or Garden of Delights, was a magnificent 12th century encyclopedia created by Herod of Landsberg for her nuns. Within its pages, among lessons on theology and morality, was an illustration of the female pope. She is shown enthroned, wearing the papal tiara, a book of wisdom in one hand. Significantly, the image is not a scene of her exposure, but of her rule. It presents her papacy as a fact, a curious and didactic piece of history for the nuns to contemplate. These artistic choices were powerful. By showing Joan in the full, majestic vestments of her office, artists made the unbelievable tangible. They answered the question, what would a female pope look like? And they showed her, solid and real, forcing the viewer to confront the possibility. Often, the imagery focused on the moment of her downfall, the shocking public birth. In woodcuts and engravings that spread with the printing press, we see Joan collapsed in her papal chair during the procession, her secret revealed to a crowd of horrified, gesturing clergy. The infant is there, a small, swaddled bundle on the ground. These images served as moral lessons and Protestant propaganda, but they also served as sensational news. They froze the most dramatic second of the legend, making it a single, shareable icon of deceit and divine punishment. The story's journey into the modern era shows how its meaning continues to shift. The 1972 film Pope Joan, starring Liv Ullmann, is a fascinating case study. It treats the legend with a new psychological and feminist sensitivity. This Joan is not merely a deceiver, but a tragic heroine, a brilliant woman crushed by a world that has no place for her intellect. The film explores her internal conflict, her loneliness, and the terrible cost of her ambition. It asks the audience to empathize with her, to see her not as a monstrous polluter of the sacred, but as a victim of an oppressive system. This reinterpretation reflects 20th century concerns about gender equality and individual freedom, using the medieval framework to tell a very modern story about a woman fighting for her right to exist fully in a man's world. Later adaptations, from novels to television series, have followed similar paths, each mining the legend for different themes. Some emphasize the thriller elements of her double life, the constant fear of discovery. Others focus on the romance with her lover or the political intrigue of the papal court. Each new version says less about the 9th century and more about the time in which it was made, revealing what a culture finds compelling or terrifying about the idea of a woman in ultimate power. These artistic depictions, from the lost fresco in Siena to the glow of a cinema screen, have done more than any chronicle to keep Pope Joan alive. They have given her a body, a face, and a setting. They have made the abstract concrete, allowing generation after generation to look upon her and decide for themselves, is this a warning, a tragedy, or a forgotten truth waiting to be seen? The legend asks us to accept not just a social deception, but a biological miracle. For Pope Joan to have reigned for over 2 years, she would have needed to conceal one of the most physically demanding and transformative processes a human body can undergo. The practical and medical realities of a 9th century pregnancy make her story, on a purely physical level, almost impossible to believe. This was not an age of loose-fitting business suits and private offices. The papal court was a crowded, intimate, and observant community. The Pope was never truly alone. He was surrounded by a constant retinue of chamberlains, secretaries, deacons, and guards, all living and working in close quarters. Their lives were intertwined with his, a fact that makes hiding the early signs of pregnancy a formidable challenge. Consider the first trimester. Morning sickness, fatigue, and food aversions are not minor inconveniences, they are pronounced physical symptoms. For a figure whose health was a matter of state and whose every meal was likely observed, a sudden, persistent nausea or a radical shift in appetite would have sparked immediate concern and prompted the attention of physicians. These were not modern doctors with discreet clinics, they were court officials whose primary duty was to maintain the health of the most important man in Christendom. Unexplained illness would not have been ignored. As the pregnancy advanced, the challenge became insurmountable. By the second and third trimesters, the body undergoes changes that are simply not concealable under layers of medieval vestments. The elaborate papal robes of the time, while voluminous, were structured garments worn over a close-fitting tunic. They were designed for ceremony and dignity, not for disguising a rapidly expanding waistline and the distinct shift in posture and gait that pregnancy brings. The idea that a woman could have attended lengthy ceremonies, presided over councils, and moved through the Vatican precincts for months while in her third trimester, without a single person in her inner circle noticing the profound alteration in her body shape, strains credulity to its limit. This was not a solitary hermit, but a public figure under the microscope of daily ritual. Every bath, every dressing, every moment of vulnerability would have required a conspiracy of silence from an improbably large number of attendants, any one of whom could have gained immense power or wealth by exposing the secret. Then we arrive at the climax of the legend, the public birth during a procession. This element, so dramatic in the telling, is perhaps the most medically absurd part of the tale. Childbirth in the 9th century was perilous, a life-threatening event even under the best, most controlled circumstances. It was managed by midwives and women in private chambers, not something anyone, let alone a pope, would have risked occurring spontaneously in the open street. For Joan to have gone into labor unexpectedly during a formal procession suggests a lack of any prenatal awareness that contradicts the entire narrative of a careful, brilliant deceiver. A woman in her position, living a double life, would have been hyper-aware of her body's timeline. She would have planned, she would have secluded herself, she would have had a story ready for an illness or retreat. The notion that she was caught utterly by surprise, with no contingency, transforms a cunning mastermind into a recklessly incompetent figure, which undermines the very intelligence the legend ascribes to her. Furthermore, the aftermath is equally implausible. A birth in the dusty Roman street without aid would have carried an enormous risk of fatal hemorrhage or infection for both mother and child. The legend's quick dispatch of Joan, whether by death in childbirth or mob violence, feels like a narrative necessity to avoid the messy, complex reality of what would have happened next. How does the Church handle a living, breathing Pope Mother and a papal infant? The story cannot accommodate that question, so it ends the scene abruptly. When we apply the harsh light of practical reality to the legend, the figure of Pope Joan begins to dissolve. She becomes less a historical person and more a collection of symbolic fears about the female body itself, imagined as a ticking time bomb of betrayal that could, at any moment, expose itself and shatter the carefully constructed world of men. The story's first clear appearance in writing emerges from the quiet scriptorium of a Dominican friar. Around the year 1250, a man named Jean de Mailly was compiling a universal chronicle in the city of Metz, a work meant to summarize world history from creation to his own day. Within its pages, nestled among accounts of kings and emperors, is a brief, shocking entry. He writes of a certain pope named John Anglicus, who was in fact a woman. He places the event in the year 1099 during a procession from St. Peter's to the Lateran. According to de Mailly, she gave birth to a child and then died on the spot, after which she was buried where she fell. His account is stark and matter-of-fact, just a few lines treating an impossible event as simple historical record. But even in this early version, the cracks of variation are visible. He calls her John Anglicus, John the Englishman, a detail that would stick. Yet he places the scandal in 1099, over 2 centuries later than the date most later chroniclers would settle on. This inconsistency is a vital clue. It tells us that when Jean de Mailly dipped his quill, the story was not a fixed, documented event. It was a floating piece of folklore, already old, already changing with each telling. The year, the precise location, even the Pope's specific identity, these details were still fluid, shaped by the teller and the audience. De Mailly was not an investigative historian uncovering a buried truth. he was a collector of tales, and he recorded the version that had reached his ears in Metz. His motive explains why such a story would find a home in a serious-looking chronicle. Jean de Mailly was a Dominican friar, a member of a preaching order dedicated to educating the masses and combating heresy. His chronicle was not written for fellow scholars in a university, but as a resource for preachers. It was a repository of moral exemplar, of striking stories and cautionary tales that a friar could weave into a sermon to capture the attention of a congregation and drive home a lesson about virtue, vice, and divine judgment. The tale of a female pope exposed in childbirth was a preacher's goldmine. It was a single, unforgettable image that encapsulated themes of deception, the punishment of pride, and the dangers of corrupted authority. For de Mailly, its historical precision was less important than its moral utility. Including it lent his chronicle a compelling, edifying story that could be used to warn the faithful. This context transforms how we read this earliest written account. It is not evidence of a fact, but evidence of a story already in wide circulation, deemed useful enough for a friar to preserve it. The Chronica Universalis Mettensis becomes a snapshot, freezing one fleeting version of a legend that was still very much alive and growing, waiting for the next chronicler to pick it up and shape it anew. Martin of Opava did not just record a rumor, he built a cage for it. Around 1277, this Dominican friar and papal chaplain sat down to write a chronicle of the popes and emperors, a work intended as a reliable guide to the past. In his entry for the year 855, between the death of Pope Leo IV and the succession of Pope Benedict III, he inserted a new name. He wrote, after Leo, John Anglicus, a native of Mainz, reigned 2 years, 5 months and 4 days, and then the quiet, devastating sentence he, it is claimed, was a woman. Martin then recounts the now familiar story, her disguise as a man, her election, her pregnancy, and her public exposure and death on the Vicus Papissa. But it was his placement of the story that gave it devastating power. He did not present it as a fable from the distant past or a strange tale from the provinces. He wove it directly into the official, sequential list of popes, giving it a date, a duration, and a specific geographical origin. This was no longer folklore, it was an entry in a historical ledger. His chronicle, known as the Chronicon Pontificum et Imperatum, became one of the most copied and distributed historical works of the late Middle Ages. It was the Wikipedia of its day, a go-to reference found in monasteries and libraries across Europe. Every time a scribe meticulously copied Martin's pages, they reproduced the Joan entry as established fact, embedding the legend deeper into the bedrock of accepted history. So why did Martin's version stick when others faded? His own credentials were a key part of the illusion. Martin of Opava was not a marginal figure, he served as a chaplain to Pope Clement IV. This position, working within the very heart of the papal court, lent his writings an air of insider authority. Readers assumed that if a man so close to the papacy wrote it, he must have had access to archives or traditions now lost to us. The paradox is exquisite. A papal insider became the primary vector for the Church's most damaging historical scandal. He also provided just enough specific, mundane detail to make the unbelievable feel documented. By naming Mainz as her birthplace, he anchored the ethereal legend to a real city on the map. A vague woman from somewhere is a myth. A woman from Mainz starts to sound like a biography. These specifics created a veneer of scholarly rigor, making the story harder to dismiss as mere invention. Furthermore, Martin wrote with a sober, unemotional tone. He did not sensationalize. He presented the events in the same flat, factual style he used for reporting papal decrees or imperial battles. This clinical delivery was perhaps his most persuasive tool. A wild story told breathlessly is a rumor. The same story told dryly in a list becomes history. His chronicle provided the perfect vessel, allowing the legend to travel under the respectable flag of scholarship. infecting the mainstream historical thought of Europe for centuries to come. In many ways, Martin of Opava did not discover Pope Joan. He invented her as a historical figure, constructing her from the raw materials of rumor and giving her a permanent, stubborn address in the timeline of the world. That peculiar marble seat, the dung chair, is more than a bizarre footnote. It represents the collision point between legend and ritual, a place where scholars still debate whether we are looking at a real object twisted by story or a story that invented its own object. The central question is stark. Was the sedia stercoraria a genuine piece of papal furniture, used in a ceremony long before the Joan legend arose that later became grotesquely reinterpreted? Or was it a complete fabrication, a satirical invention that gave the legend a physical, mocking proof? The arguments on both sides reveal how history and myth can become impossibly tangled. One school of thought gives the chair a legitimate, if strange, origin. They point to ancient traditions of humility in leadership. In this view, the pierced marble seat may have originally been a birthing stool, a common object in the ancient world, later brought into the Lateran palace as a curious antique. During a new pope's installation, he might have been made to sit on this lowly, functional object. A handful of coins or a bit of chaff would be placed on it, and as he sat, they would fall through the hole. This act was a powerful, theatrical reminder of a biblical verse, "All flesh is grass." It symbolized the Pope's mortality, that he was just a man, born from dust and returning to dust. The ritual was designed to humble the supreme pontiff at the very moment of his exaltation, a check against arrogance. Over centuries, as memory of the original symbolism faded, the chair's odd appearance, a hole in a seat, demanded a new explanation. When the scandalous tale of a female pope giving birth in the streets began to circulate, it provided a perfect, if lurid, answer. The humble birthing stool was retroactively transformed into a tool for gender verification. The whispered joke in the corridors became the accepted history. The other school of thought finds this too convenient. They argue there is no reliable, contemporary evidence that such a specific ritual with this specific chair ever took place during a medieval papal coronation. The earliest detailed descriptions of papal ceremonies make no mention of it. Instead, the first clear accounts linking the chair to a physical examination appear in the 15th and 16th centuries, in texts that are often anti-papal or openly satirical. From this perspective, the sedia stercoraria is not a repurposed relic, but a piece of political satire made material. Invented by critics of the papacy, the story of the examination served a dual purpose. It mocked the opaque, elaborate rituals of the Vatican as absurd and vulgar, and it provided a perfect, pseudo-historical reason for how the Joan scandal could have happened and why it could never happen again. It was a joke that hardened into believed fact. So, is there any physical evidence? The search for the actual chair is itself a ghost hunt. For centuries, guides showed visitors a worn marble seat in the Vatican grottos, claiming it was the very one. Art historians, however, note that its design resembles ancient Roman toilets more than birthing stools, and its provenance is hopelessly murky. No archaeological dig in the Lateran palace has uncovered a throne matching the description with a verifiable papal link. The lack of a clear artifact does not definitively prove anything, but it deepens the mystery. It leaves us with a powerful idea that outran its object. Whether the chair began as a tool for humility or as a satirical cartoon, its lasting power comes from the story it tells. It embodies a deep public desire to see the mighty humbled, to imagine a ritual that forces the most powerful man in Christendom to prove his basic humanity or his masculinity in the most undignified way possible. The sedia stercoraria, real or not, stands as a monument not to a pope, but to the irresistible urge to believe that behind every symbol of absolute authority, there is a whole and a truth waiting to be revealed. From a few lines in a friar's chronicle, the story began its relentless march across a continent. the legend of Pope Joan did not remain a dusty entry in a library manuscript. It escaped into the air, carried by the two most powerful forces in medieval Europe, the pulpit and the stage. Preachers, always in need of vivid moral lessons, seized upon the tale. It was a sermon writer's dream, a single image that could illustrate the sins of pride, deception, and the corruption of holy office. From cathedral pulpits in Paris to village churches in the Rhineland, congregations heard about the popess who was exposed by God's own hand. Each retelling added weight. Each sermon treated it not as rumor, but as a historical fact with a divine lesson attached. This oral transmission through the church itself gave the legend an unofficial stamp of authority, weaving it into the very fabric of popular belief. But the story truly came to life when it stepped off the page and onto the stage. In town squares and during religious festivals, traveling players performed mystery plays and folk dramas. Among the biblical tales and saintly miracles, the shocking story of Pope Joan found a natural home. These plays were not subtle historical debates, they were visceral, emotional spectacles. Audiences could see the robed figure, witness the dramatic moment of revelation in the street, and react to the horror of the clergy. This theatrical form transformed abstract scandal into shared community experience, memorizing the legend in the public mind through drama and costume. As the story traveled, it adapted, wearing local colors. In France, she was often La Papist Jean, a figure of scandalous romance. In Germany, chroniclers and playwrights frequently made her one of their own, a brilliant woman from Mainz, perhaps tapping into local pride or anti-Italian sentiment. In England, she was firmly John Anglicus, the Englishman, a detail that may have carried a strange, subversive national pride even within a condemning narrative. By the time the story reached Italy, the heart of the church it criticized, it was already old news, but it took on a sharper, more immediate satirical edge in the land of the Pope himself. This geographic spread created a fascinating paradox. Here was a story with no contemporary evidence, born in a specific time of anti-papal criticism, yet within a few generations it was accepted as common knowledge from Dublin to Krakow. A peasant in England and a merchant in Bavaria might disagree on countless points of doctrine, but they could likely both tell you the story of the female pope. This was not the spread of a fact, but the conquest of a narrative. Its success lay in its perfect utility. For a German reformer, it proved the Roman hierarchy was blind. For an English critic, it showed the international church was fallible. For a French satirist, it revealed the hypocrisy beneath the splendid robes. The legend was a weapon that could be picked up and wielded by anyone with a grievance against centralized ecclesiastical power, and across a fragmented Europe that meant almost everyone. The tale's variations are not evidence of a hidden truth slowly coming to light. They are the fingerprints of a story being retold, each culture bending it slightly to fit its own anxieties and its own disputes. The map of her legend is not a map of historical discovery. It is a map of medieval public opinion, tracing the pathways of distrust, satire, and the universal human love for a scandal that brings the mighty low. By the time Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door, the legend of Pope Joan was already centuries old, but it had never been more useful. For the Protestant reformers of the 16th century, this story was not a curious historical footnote. It was a divine gift, a weapon of mass persuasion handed to them by history itself. In their existential battle to dismantle the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, Pope Joan became the ultimate exhibit, the smoking gun that proved the papacy was not just flawed, but was a monstrous fraud. Martin Luther himself wielded the tale with devastating effect. In his polemical writings, he cited the female pope repeatedly, not as a legend, but as an established, undeniable fact. For Luther, Joan was the living, breathing proof of divine judgment. How could an institution that allowed a woman, and a pregnant woman at that, to sit on the throne of St. Peter possibly claim to be guided by the Holy Spirit? He argued that this single scandal invalidated the entire concept of papal succession, turning the line of popes into a grotesque parody of spiritual leadership. John Calvin, the systematic theologian of Geneva, echoed this sentiment with cold, logical fury. In his seminal work, Institutes of the Christian Religion, he pointed to Pope Joan as clear evidence that the Roman Church had long ago forfeited any claim to be the true Church. If the very seat of St. Peter could be occupied by such an abomination, Calvin reasoned, then that seat was clearly under Satan's influence, not God's. The Reformers did not debate the details of her reign. They trumpeted the simple, visceral core of the story: a woman pope, a pregnancy, a public birth. This sequence was a perfect, self-contained argument that required no theological training to understand. It translated complex doctrinal disputes about authority and scripture into a single, unforgettable image of hypocrisy and collapse. This image was then mass-produced and weaponized for the first time in history, thanks to the printing press. Protestant pamphleteers and artists churned out illustrated broadsheets, cheap single-page publications that could be sold in markets or nailed to town gates. These were the viral memes of the Reformation, designed for maximum impact on a largely illiterate populace. The broadsheets depicting Pope Joan were masterpieces of anti-papal propaganda. They showed the scene of her downfall in lurid, mocking detail. There she is, the papal tiara tumbling from her head, her robes in disarray, as she gives birth in the middle of a stunned procession. The surrounding clergy are often drawn with grotesque, horrified faces, their gestures exaggerated for comic and damning effect. The imagery was deliberately shocking and vulgar, meant to provoke disgust and ridicule. It visually argued that the papacy was not a sacred office, but a carnival of deceit, its grandeur nothing more than a costume hiding a scandalous reality. These pamphlets did more than tell a story. They performed a symbolic execution. By repeatedly depicting the moment of her exposure, they were symbolically exposing and humiliating the entire papal institution again and again. Every time a farmer looked at that crude woodcut, he internalized a powerful message: the Pope is a fake, the Church is a lie. The legend's utility was perfectly timed. The Reformation was at its heart a crisis of authority. Who had the right to interpret Scripture? Who stood between the believer and God? The Catholic answer was the Pope and the magisterium of the Church. The Protestant answer was Scripture alone and the priesthood of all believers. Pope Joan served as the perfect wrecking ball against the Catholic answer. If the Pope could be so profoundly, biologically wrong, then his authority was null and void. The story provided a historical precedent that made the unthinkable thinkable. It made the fall of the papacy seem not like a radical new idea, but like a return to justice, a correction of an ancient error that God himself had already exposed. In the hands of the Reformers, Pope Joan was transformed from a medieval cautionary tale into a foundational pillar of Protestant identity. She became the favorite pope of the Reformation, not because they admired her, but because her imagined failure proved everything they wanted to believe. Her legend was no longer about one woman's deception. It was about an entire system's legitimacy crumbling to dust on a Roman street, and for the Reformers, that dust was the fertile ground in which a new faith could grow. The battle over Pope Joan moved from pulpits and pamphlets into the quiet, methodical world of the archive. By the 19th century, a new kind of investigator took up the case, armed not with polemic, but with philology and source criticism. These historians approached the legend not as a weapon or a sin, but as a historical problem to be solved through evidence. Their work would systematically dismantle the myth brick by brick. The shift began even earlier with a cardinal of the Counter-Reformation, Cesare Baronius. In the late 1500s, he undertook a monumental task compiling the Annals Ecclesiastici, a year-by-year history of the Church. Facing the entrenched legend of Joan, Baronius did something radical for his time. He applied a rudimentary form of source criticism. He looked at the earliest available records from the 9th century itself, the letters, the imperial annals, the contemporary chronicles. He found no mention of a female pope, only the smooth succession from Leo IV to Benedict III. Confronted with this silence, Baronius made a decisive editorial choice. In his list of popes, he included Joan, but with a crucial annotation. He placed an asterisk next to her name and wrote that her story was a fable unworthy of belief, inserted by later writers. This was a pivotal moment. A leading church historian, using the earliest sources he could find, officially categorized the tale as fiction within a scholarly work. It was a declaration based on evidence, not just doctrine. The real death blow, however, came in the 19th century with the rise of modern scientific history. Scholars like the German historian Philipp Jaffe devoted their careers to the meticulous reconstruction of medieval papal records. Jaffe's work was painstaking. He didn't just read chronicles, he compared them. He tracked the provenance of manuscripts, asking when they were written, by whom, and what sources they used. He applied philology, the study of language development, to detect anachronisms. When he turned his attention to the mid-9th century, he reconstructed the chronology with forensic detail. His research showed a complete and coherent timeline. Pope Leo IV died in July 855. By September of that same year, Pope Benedict III was consecrated and issuing documents. The historical paper trail was continuous, with letters, synodal acts, and diplomatic correspondence flowing without interruption. There was no 2-year gap. There was no mysterious period of silence where a hidden pope could have ruled. Jaffe and others exposed the anachronisms woven into the Joan story itself. The legend described specific titles and administrative structures that did not exist in the 9th century, but were common in the 13th century when the tale was first written down. It was like finding a smartphone described in a diary supposedly from the American Civil War, a glaring clue that the story was written much later. The methods of source criticism revealed the legend's journey. Scholars traced how a brief, vague note in one chronicle was copied and expanded in another, each scribe adding new, dramatic details. They showed how the story migrated in the timeline, first appearing in the 1100s, then being pushed back to the 1000s by one writer, and finally anchored in the 850s by Martin of Opava. This was not the recovery of a lost truth, it was the mapping of a rumor's evolution. By the dawn of the 20th century, the verdict within academic history was unanimous and emphatic. The case was closed. For professional historians, Pope Joan was not a suppressed reality, but a fascinating medieval fiction. She was a cultural artifact, a mirror reflecting the anxieties, humor, and political conflicts of the later Middle Ages, not a person who ever walked the streets of Rome. The myth was dead as history, but its ghost, as we have seen, was far from laid to rest. The human mind is a story-hungry engine, and the tale of Pope Joan is a feast. It satisfies cravings we scarcely admit we have. At its core, this legend is a perfect piece of psychological architecture, built from irresistible narrative pillars. It offers the thrill of forbidden knowledge, the secret history they do not want you to know. It presents a brilliant underdog, using her wit to conquer a world designed to exclude her. It culminates in the most shocking taboo imaginable, exposed in the most public way possible, and it ends with a dramatic, catastrophic fall, a divine or societal punishment that delivers a moral lesson while also providing a spectacle. This is not just a story, it is a recipe for a story that sticks in the cultural memory for 1,000 years. It has the structure of a tragedy, the suspense of a thriller, and the transgressive kick of a secret finally told. We are drawn to it for the same reason we lean in to hear a whispered rumor. It promises to reveal a crack in the monolithic facade of power. The legend allows us for a moment to envision the impossible, to see the most rigid hierarchy in the world turned upside down by a single determined person. It is a fantasy of intellectual triumph where a woman's mind is so potent it can bypass every gatekeeper. This speaks to a deep, subconscious desire to challenge unyielding authority, especially the patriarchal structures that have defined so much of history. The story lets us imagine a world where the rules can be subverted, where the gatekeepers can be fooled, and where the ultimate seat of male spiritual power is, however briefly, occupied by the very entity it was built to exclude. That moment of her reign is a psychological victory, a narrative revolt against the established order, and then, of course, the story slams the door shut. The fall is as necessary as the rise. The pregnancy and public exposure serve a crucial psychological function. They release the tension of the transgression. They assure the audience that the natural order, though challenged, will reassert itself, often violently. This provides a safe way to explore a dangerous idea, to flirt with the fantasy of upheaval, and then to be comfortably returned to the familiar world, having been thrilled and chastened in equal measure. It is a cultural safety valve. In modern times, however, the legend has undergone a remarkable transformation. Where medieval listeners might have heard a cautionary tale about the dangers of female ambition, many today hear a very different story. For some, Pope Joan has been reclaimed as a feminist icon, a proto-heroine. She is seen as a symbol of a woman shattering the ultimate glass ceiling centuries before the term was invented. Her disguise is reinterpreted not as deceit, but as a necessary strategy for a genius born into the wrong gender, the only way for her intellect to find its rightful place. Her papacy becomes a lost era of wise, if secret, female leadership. This modern reading consciously chooses to focus on the triumph rather than the fall, on her agency rather than her punishment. It is a fascinating act of reclamation, taking a story rooted in deep medieval misogyny and repurposing it as a symbol of female resilience and capability. This duality is the legend's true power. It functions as a Rorschach test for the culture examining it. To a medieval preacher, she was a warning. To a Protestant reformer, she was a weapon. To a 19th century historian, she was a problem to be solved. And to a modern audience, she can be a tragic pioneer. Her story is empty enough to be filled with our own anxieties and aspirations, yet specific enough to feel tantalizingly real. We want to believe not necessarily because the evidence points there, but because the story she represents of hidden potential, of challenged authority, of a secret history that changes everything, is a story we are wired to find compelling. The legend of Pope Joan endures because it is not about a pope at all. It is about us and our endless fascination with the walls we build and the people who dare to climb them. One of the strangest pieces of supposed evidence was not a document but a body. For centuries, travelers to Rome reported seeing a macabre exhibit, the mummified remains of Pope Joan and her infant child. Pilgrims and curious visitors were guided to a shadowy corner of a church or a side street, where a glass case held a horrifying spectacle. There lay a desiccated female figure in tattered papal vestments, a small, shriveled form cradled in her arms or lying beside her. This was not a whispered rumor, it was a physical attraction you could stand before and stare at, a tangible, gruesome proof that seemed to end all debate. Accounts from the late medieval period through the Renaissance consistently mention this relic. It became a standard stop on the tour for the educated European traveler, a shocking must-see that confirmed the scandal they had only read about in books. The mummy served a powerful psychological purpose. It transformed a story from the realm of ideas into the realm of the senses. You could see the Chinese letter I sockets, the brittle fingers, the faded silk of the robes. It made the legend visceral and undeniable. If her body was right here, how could the story be a lie? This relic provided the ultimate closure for a curious public, a definitive answer to the question of what happened to her after that fateful procession. It offered a morbidly satisfying end to the tale, a monument to her shame that could be visited and pondered. But where did this mummy actually come from? The answer reveals a classic case of mistaken identity and entrepreneurial deception. Rome sits atop layers of ancient history, a city constantly unearthing remnants of its past. During the Middle Ages and Renaissance, excavations frequently turned up ancient Roman and even older Egyptian mummies brought to Rome during the imperial era. These artifacts were poorly understood. To a public with no concept of archaeology, a preserved body was simply a preserved body, its origin a mystery waiting for a story. It is almost certain that the so-called Pope Joan mummy was one of these ancient corpses, perhaps an Egyptian woman buried with a child, or a Roman noblewoman carefully embalmed. Enterprising locals, seeing the endless stream of pilgrims hungry for evidence of the famous Popus, saw an opportunity. By dressing the anonymous mummy in fabricated papal regalia and placing it in a strategic location, they created the perfect tourist trap. They manufactured the very evidence the public craved, turning a profit while cementing the legend in the minds of thousands. This strange footnote shows us that the hunger for proof can be so strong it creates its own reality. The mummy was a mirror reflecting not 9th century history, but the powerful human desire to touch the stories we tell, to make our myths into something we can point to and say, "See, it was real." In a world before forensic science, a curious relic and a good story were often all the proof anyone needed. The story of Joan found its most elegant early champion not in a chronicler but in a poet. Giovanni Boccaccio, the 14th century Italian author of the Decameron, included her in another work, De Mulieribus Claris, or On Famous Women. This was a revolutionary collection, one of the first in Western literature devoted solely to biographies of women, both virtuous and notorious. Boccaccio's Joan is a figure of dazzling intellect and profound deception. He presents her not with the dry factuality of a monkish chronicle, but with the flair of a storyteller captivated by her audacity. For Boccaccio, she is the ultimate example of female cunning, a woman whose brilliant mind allowed her to navigate and conquer a world never meant for her. His account is ambivalent, a mix of admiration for her prowess and a moralistic shudder at the outcome. This literary treatment was a pivotal shift. It moved Joan from the pages of history into the realm of character, a personality to be analyzed, debated, and dramatized. She was no longer just an entry in a list, she was a subject for the humanist imagination, a complex symbol of what a woman could achieve if freed from her constraints and the terrible price she would pay. As centuries turned, the legend proved endlessly malleable, a mirror for each new age's preoccupations. By the Enlightenment, a period that prized reason and satirized superstition, writers seized upon Joan for a different purpose. She became a weapon of wit, not piety. Playwrights and poets used her story to lampoon the Catholic Church, not to warn of female deceit, but to mock what they saw as institutional absurdity and blind dogma. In these satires, the focus shifted from Joan's sin to the Church's gullibility. The humor lay in imagining an entire, powerful hierarchy fooled by a simple disguise, exposing the supposed infallibility of the papacy as a farce. The legend was stripped of its medieval terror and reborn as comedy, a sharp tool in the intellectual battle between emerging secular thought and traditional religious authority. Each retelling, from Boccaccio's humanist portrait to the Enlightenment's mocking verses, subtly reshaped the clay of the story, pressing into it the fingerprints of a new era's anxieties and amusements. This evolution reached its modern zenith in the late 20th century, with a novel that transformed a medieval cautionary tale into a global phenomenon of female empowerment. Donna Woolfolk Cross' 1996 historical novel Pope Joan did something no prior work had fully accomplished. It presented Joan not as a symbol, a cipher, or a punchline, but as a complete, sympathetic human being. Cross meticulously researched the Carolingian world, building a vivid backdrop of mud, medicine, and political intrigue. Her Joan is a prodigy, a healer, a woman of profound compassion and fierce intelligence, driven not by a desire to deceive, but by an unquenchable thirst for knowledge and a will to escape a brutal, circumscribed life. The novel frames her disguise as a tragic necessity, the only path available for a mind of her caliber. It explores the psychological toll of her double life, the loneliness, the constant fear, and even the complexity of her relationship with the lover who fathers her child. Cross-interpretation resonated powerfully with a contemporary audience. It aligned with late 20th century feminist thought, recasting Joan as a heroine who triumphs against an oppressive patriarchal system, if only for a time. The book became an international bestseller, sparking renewed fascination and debate, and later inspired a major motion picture. Its success underscores a timeless truth about this legend. We do not discover Pope Joan, we reinvent her. In Boccaccio's Renaissance, she exemplified cunning. In the Enlightenment, she served satire. In cross-modern novel, she embodies the struggle for female agency against impossible odds. The story itself is a constant, but the meaning we pour into it is a reflection of who we are and what we need her to be, a warning, a joke, or finally, a heroine for our own time. Her story did not vanish from the streets of Rome, it became one of them. According to the legend, Pope Joan was not given a Christian burial in hallowed ground. Instead, she was interred right where she fell, on that narrow lane between the Colosseum and the Church of St. Clement. This detail served a grim purpose. It transformed her death from a private tragedy into a permanent public lesson, a warning stamped into the very cobblestones. The spot became known as the Vicus Papissa, the Street of the Popes, a name that echoed through Roman guidebooks and travelers' tales for centuries. Medieval maps of the city, drawn for pilgrims, often included this label, marking it as a point of morbid curiosity on the sacred tourist trail. It was a place where the past was said to bleed into the present, where the geography of the city held a secret. The legend grew an additional, compelling branch. It was said that later popes, knowing the scandal, would deliberately alter their procession routes to avoid passing over her unmarked grave. They would take a longer, circuitous path rather than risk the spiritual pollution of crossing the remains of the false pontiff. This anecdote is psychologically powerful. It suggests a deep, superstitious fear persisting within the Vatican itself, an institutional memory of shame so potent it could reroute papal ceremony. But did this street, this haunted lane, truly exist? The answer is a fascinating mix of yes and no. The Vicus Papissa was a real label on real maps, a documented part of the medieval Roman landscape. Its location, however, is the key. The lane identified by that name in the Middle Ages was not some forgotten, cursed-back alley. It was a section of a major ancient thoroughfare, the Via Sacra, the very road Roman emperors and triumphant generals once paraded down. The legend, in its classic irony, had taken the most sacred street of pagan Rome and rebranded it as the most shameful street of Christian Rome. This layering of meanings is perfect. The story physically overwrote the city's history, imposing a new, salacious narrative onto old stones. The name served as a constant, walking reminder of the tale, ensuring that every time a local used the street or a pilgrim asked for directions, the story of the Popes was reinforced not through books but through the lived experience of the city itself. Given such a specific location, one might wonder, has anyone ever looked for her? Has there been an archaeological dig, a search for bones beneath the Vicus Papissa? The short answer is no, and for reasons that reveal the chasm between legend and science. Professional archaeology does not go hunting for ghosts. It investigates sites based on historical records, material evidence, and specific research questions about how people lived. To mount an excavation aimed solely at finding the bones of Pope Joan would be to start from the assumption that the legend is true, a premise that all available documentary evidence contradicts. It would be like digging under London Bridge to find the body of the mythical Princess London Bridge is falling down. the effort would be considered not just futile, but fundamentally unserious from a scholarly perspective. Furthermore, Rome is a living city built atop millennia of rubble. The ground level of the ancient Via Sacra is now many feet below the modern street. Any remains that might have been hastily buried there in the 9th century, if they existed at all, would have been utterly disrupted by centuries of construction, flooding, and the relentless passage of time. You would not be searching for a single, identifiable skeleton. You would be sifting through a chaotic ossuary of centuries, looking for a needle in a haystack that was itself scattered by an earthquake. The true power of the empty tomb legend lies not in what could be found, but in what its absence represents. The lack of a grave, the very emptiness, becomes the perfect vessel for the story. A known burial site with a clear epitaph would pin the tale down, make it finite and testable. But a grave that is only spoken of, a patch of street avoided by popes, is infinitely more potent. It allows the mystery to breathe. It turns a lane into a phantom limb of the city, a place that feels haunted not by a ghost but by a story everyone knows. The Vicus Papissa demonstrates how a legend physically embeds itself, how it colonizes geography and bends behavior, creating a shared memory so strong it feels like history. We avoid the spot not because a body is there, but because the idea of the body is there. In the end, the search for Pope Joan's resting place was always destined to be a walk through a landscape of words, not dirt, a journey through the maps we draw in our minds to make sense of the shadows we fear. So we are left not with a person, but with a question. If Pope Joan was never a flesh and blood woman in the 9th century, what exactly have we been chasing all this time? The answer is perhaps more valuable than a simple yes or no. We have been chasing a ghost, but a ghost made of something very real: the fears, the jokes, and the political battles of 1,000 years of European history. Her story is a fabrication, yes, but it is a fabrication that tells the truth. It tells the truth about a medieval world terrified of female intelligence infiltrating sacred male spaces. It tells the truth about reformers who needed a scandalous symbol to smash the icons of a corrupt institution. It tells the truth about how a good story, once it takes root, can grow harder than stone, inventing its own artifacts, its own geography, and its own undeniable presence in the public mind. Pope Joan is not a window into the past. She is a mirror held up by generation after generation, and what we see reflected in her is not her face, but their own deepest anxieties about power, deception, and the terrifying possibility that the foundations of their world were built on sand. Her enduring fascination lies precisely in this paradox. She is a historical nullity who became a cultural giant. We keep returning to her legend not to solve a cold case, but because the story itself is a masterclass in human psychology. It shows us how a culture processes its taboos, how it weaponizes narrative, and how a simple, shocking idea can travel across centuries, shape-shifting to fit every new conflict. So the next time you hear a tale that seems too outrageous to be true, and yet too persistent to be false, remember Pope Joan. Ask yourself not just if it happened, but why it is being told. What fear does it soothe? What authority does it challenge? What hidden desire does it secretly fulfill? In the end, the greatest mystery is not whether a woman once sat on the throne of St. Peter, but why we have never been able to stop wondering what it would mean if she did. Thank you for joining this deep dive into one of history's most captivating and stubborn legends. We have sifted through ancient chronicles, walked the Vicus Papissa, and seen how a story can be forged in the fires of political warfare and cultural fear. The evidence, as weighed by centuries of scholarship, points clearly to a powerful myth. Yet that final, simple question lingers. Do you believe there is a hidden kernel of truth to the tale of Pope Joan? Or do you see it as a magnificent work of pure fiction, a ghost story told by history itself? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into the shadows of the past, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next exploration into the world's greatest historical enigmas. For in the end, perhaps the most profound lesson of the Pope Joan legend is this: sometimes the lies we choose to tell about our past reveal far more about who we are and what we fear than any simple truth ever could.